Aditya Naganath. I am a principal at Kleiner Perkins, and I love cappuccinos.
Folks, welcome back to the MLOps.community podcast. As always, I am your host, Demetrios, and we are in for a wild ride in this conversation. As you may have seen, occasionally I like to bring on some VCs to hear what they think about the current state of the market and the space. This is one of those times. I got to talk with Aditya about how he sees MLOps tooling, LLMOps tooling, if you want to call it that, infrastructure and AI infrastructure, and what the difference is between those two, because I needed a little bit of clarification on that. And oh, so much more, where he's excited about investing and where he's not excited about investing. He made me rethink some of my previous assumptions, and I hope some of the stuff he said is wrong for the sake of my portfolio companies, but you know what? He made some convincing arguments, so let me know what you think in the comments or give me some feedback. Tell me if you are seeing the same thing that he is seeing, or if you're seeing something totally different. Let's get into it, and as always, if you enjoy this episode, share it with one friend. We are in a field that is very busy, and you more than anyone know that because you are investing in this field. How does it feel to be an investor in the AI space these days, man? It's got to be wild.
Thanks for having me, Demetrios. It is indeed wild. It is crazy out there, and the reason for that is we just see so many kind of ideas emerging, and at the same time, so many different startups tackling those ideas.
Mm.
So for any one interesting idea, you have 10 or 12 pretty solid teams taking a crack at it, and our job is to pick one. So then the question is, how do you do that?
I hear people talk a lot about, oh, well, it's got to be the team. It's got to be the team. Do you have any other insights that you tend to lean on or biases? Dare I say it?
Yeah. Um, I think beyond the team, I want to just see some semblance of a novel approach, right? And ultimately, the question is, what are you gonna do to rise above the quote unquote noise floor? And I think there are people who are just like, hey, this is a pretty consensus opportunity, and we want to go for it. That's not that exciting. I want to see someone actually put some thought into look like, there are 12 other pretty solid folks going after this, but here's why I actually think we have a chance. And it kind of points to the details and points to, say, having put in more thought into the actual underpinnings of a successful product.
And I can imagine a lot of times that has to do with go-to-market motions.
Go to market for sure, right? Like, if you think about at the end of the day, what it takes, right? It's a great team that has a great product that has very good go to market, right? So in
Uh,
that sense, it's not rocket science, but you know, good go to market follows a great product, and then so to me, it's still about what is going to be that insight that drives a really novel approach that yields a great product, which will then yield a great go to market.
Yeah, it feels like one way to bet on a team or have a little bit more success rate is if you know that the founders or the team has some kind of advantage on that go to market and their motion, whether that's like the founder has a lot of distribution or is well followed or has a community or has been very active in communities, that type of thing just feels like, oh, there's an unfair advantage here. And so you can't count that out.
For sure, for sure. Any kind of distribution tailwinds that you can generate helps, but at the same time, you don't want to be one of these flash in the pan kind of companies that has, steep revenue growth, but then realize that, hey, look, that again, the foundations were unstable, and as a result, 2 years out, 3 years out, that company has churned a bunch of customers, or that growth is, a shadow of what it was, right? So
Yeah.
there's no substitute for thoughtful product execution.
And what about those companies like a Lensa where it's a fad and maybe in the hype, in the peak of the fad, you're trying to discern if this is lasting or if this is just a flash in the pan?
And first of all, I'll say consumer is hard, right? And if you think
Mm,
about consumer in as a black box, it's all about user retention because at the end of the day, you're competing for people's time and attention, right?
yeah,
And that's gotten so hard with obviously the Facebooks and all sorts of other apps of the world. So we pay a lot of attention to retention data.
yeah. So, there is a so consumer is a beast. I like how you put that it is a black box, and when we're dealing with AI, so you get the double black box, and 2 wrongs don't make a right. I can imagine how it's a bit of a crapshoot. You're going to the casino with some AI apps for consumers, but what I'm really interested in talking about with you is the MLOps space, the AI infrastructure space, and then the apps space or the application layer, as some people call it, because I want to know first and foremost, there was this Cambridge explosion that happened with machine learning platform tooling companies in, let's say, 2018 to 2021, 2022. And I would love to know what you need to see now from a company that was funded in that stage to make you a true believer.
Of course, a great business is one that has a lot of revenue and is generating that revenue efficiently. But really, what that points to is, um, in the ML ops world in particular, were they able to show enough value to their buyer set such that that buyer set wanted to buy the solution versus build in house? And if you kind of think about the ML ops landscape as a whole, again, from the perspective of a venture investor, a lot of those companies haven't been great outcomes, right? Like Scale AI is one that obviously is a great outcome, but they were far left in terms of the value chain of an MLOps or
Yeah,
ML engineer, right? Like they handled labeling data that nobody will want to do in house, right?
yeah,
But if you think about all of these companies that emerge with like, A/B testing your model, like evaluating your model and, being a feature engineering platform or what have you, the sad reality is that they couldn't really crack these larger enterprise contracts because those enterprises had teams that would build those solutions in-house tailored to their own needs.
mhm. Do you feel like there is still too much custom white glove that needs to happen with the way that the each enterprise has architected their ML platform? You can't quite sell this standardized tool into the platform, so you haven't seen such a large takeoff like was anticipated in that 2018, 2020 era.
That's right. I still believe that. And, even if you are able to sell something into these enterprises, what I found is that you tend to capture a small portion of budget because you fit into a narrow sliver of that overall
Uh,
workflow or value chain. And the
oh,
big challenge for these companies has been to the dream rather for these companies has been to actually own a lot of that value chain. But
yeah.
again, because of the amount of customization that's been required, it's been really hard.
How do you compare that with the data platform? Do you feel like, because if in my eyes, what I've seen is that there is a lot more growth there, and it does feel like there are companies that have taken off. So I'm always questioning, is it the maturity of the ML platforms, or is it that ML is such a small TAM or such a small sliver, and it is a very, as you mentioned, unique use case, but almost everyone is going to have a data platform, whether you're doing ML or you're doing analytics, whatever it is. So there's a there's a larger TAM there.
Yeah, great question. I do think it's a larger TAM, right? And if you look at the companies that have really broken out, whether it's Databricks and Snowflake, et cetera, they've really made their money off of compute or storage.
Uh-huh.
And that's really anchored to this trend of data only exploding in the enterprise, right? Structured, and then you have unstructured data that's 4x as large as structured data. And, in the case of Databricks, they sold a compute fabric, right? Ultimately, Spark was a better way to do computations over large swaths of data, essentially through this innovation called the RDD, which allowed you to do in-memory computations. And they monetized that, right? So they were in the flow of compute. And then with Snowflake, it was, hey, look, again, we'll just give you a way more efficient warehouse on top of, again, your growing swaths of data. So they anchored themselves to that trend. Now you've also had, to your point, pretty successful companies that have existed in that value chain of data operations, right? So DBT being a shining example,
Yeah.
where they've owned transformation. Um, but, I would say the jury's out on how big DBT will be as a company, but it's still a much better outcome compared to a lot of these MLOps companies, right? That have also
Yeah.
tried to go after, analogous workflows. So, yeah, overall a bigger market because data was only exploding and people across the board needed to do interesting things with their data. While in the MLOps world, to me, it feels as though, these ML practitioners, they were doing a bunch of custom things with their models, but ultimately it's unclear what that secular trend was for a startup to go and anchor themselves against. Beyond, by the way, what Scale AI did, which of course, they were very smart in identifying that every model is going to be powered again by, surprise, surprise, labeled data.
Yeah. So knowing that, and I appreciate these almost like cold buckets of water that you're pouring on me right now. Uh, and I wonder, being equipped with that vision, do you try to dig deeper into the new ways that compute and data slash storage are coming out? Because I know there's no shortage of companies that are trying to reinvent the ways that we're using compute or just take down Spark, if we want to be blunt.
Totally. So, I presume you're alluding to this whole AI wave, right? And the
Yeah.
reality is that they have introduced two new workloads of note, right? LLM training and inference. And what's happened is you can think of the infrastructure layers being bifurcated across LLM ops companies, right? And these are the companies of the same ilk as these ML ops companies that preceded. And then you have companies that are true infrastructure across, compute, storage, and we're now seeing an emerging class of networking companies. So what I've
Uh-huh.
found is that, the compute layer has been quite interesting to invest in. And in fact, we at Kleiner Perkins invested in a company called Together AI
Uh-huh.
because it turns out that, on both obviously LLM training and inference, there's a ton of demand, right, from these models. And so anyone who can figure out how to, serve that compute at a cheaper rate and with lower latency has a chance at being very valuable. They essentially, again, monetize through compute. Then there's a company called Vast Data, which is finding themselves in the data centers themselves and essentially being the hub for, again, petabytes scale of training data. And they have done very well as a result. The jury is still out, I would say, on the LLM ops companies, right? And you have a ton of companies going after, say, evaluations, and we're seeing companies try to be, data curation platforms, and we'll see. Like, we haven't invested in that layer, and again, I think the big question is, will there be one that is able to break the build versus buy mold, and also be able to rise above all of these other competitors that look pretty identical to each other.
Talk to me more about the LLM ops paradigm and how you have sat out up until now. You're saying, "We'll take the wait and see approach," because probably a lot of things look familiar from the MLOps. Is it, again, that you're looking at a small TAM? Because when I look at LLM workloads and the AI infrastructure, I 100% agree with you where there's been the Cambrian explosion. It's a lot of similar tools, and that's not very inspiring. But I do feel like you have a much broader user base because you're not only getting the ML practitioners, you're also getting a lot of software developers who now are playing with AI APIs, and they can go out and they can put a few API calls together, and now they're an AI engineer, which in the MLOps era, you didn't have that. You were looking at a much smaller subset of the engineering world.
Yeah, when I actually think about MLOps, yes, you had your machine learning engineers who were the guys behind a lot of the interesting models of that world, but you also had software developers as well who were able to, write Python and make a call to XGBoost and get some interesting outputs, right? And
Yeah.
so in the LLM ops world, what I think has happened is you have, people coming up the maturity curve, right? And so again, LLMs are a black box. That's what's different. They're non-deterministic. And so compared to, some of the typical machine learning models, there's, a question around reliability and how do we work with the outputs that these things provide, which if you're a bull, you can make the case that you will need scaffolding tools to work with these things. And then the question is, will people want to build those tools in house or just buy off the shelf? Because again, all they care about is, the use case and the problem they're solving. At the same time, the AI, I would say the question is, what is the scope to differentiate yourself, right? Because let's take again this really hot category of LLM evaluations, right? A lot of teams have identified this pretty, obvious problem that hey, LLMs are not always reliable. Their outputs will many times drift against your key objective, and sometimes it's not even knowable why they drifted against this key objective. So can we
Yeah.
first start with just giving you observability and then over time work our way into helping you fine tune, reprompt your model to be better. The question to me then is, what is someone going to do that's markedly different from the 12 or 15 other companies going after this problem? And then I think the second thing to keep in mind is, look, like a couple of years from now, like people are going to be that much more aware of how to work with these things. There's going to be that much more knowledge disseminated around LMs that engineers will read and get smarter about. And then so when they do, um, you could still have a situation where people build in house because they have custom needs, right? So I think that's my concern with that overall market opportunity. It doesn't feel like it's provably big yet, and on top of that, it feels like it's getting chopped up in many different pieces.
So now I have to ask, why is Together different? Because it does feel like Together is in that space, and we say Together because you guys invested in them, but we can also throw out, just so that we're not completely biased. I hope you allow me to humor you. There's a few other tools that are in the same space, right? Like I would consider Modal part of that space, and Base 10, and maybe Beam.cloud, maybe Lepton and RunPod. Do you consider them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Runpod,
Okay.
fireworks, right? So you're absolutely right. There are
Fireworks. I forgot about them. Yeah.
a ton of folks who are also operating at that compute layer, right? Which I would still demarcate as separate versus the LLM ops category.
Uh-huh.
So that's number one.
Because? Why is that?
Because I think of them as actually core providers of infrastructure in some sense, right? They are ultimately providing compute. While to me, LLM ops is more about, hey, are you providing some tooling that kind of works around the LLM? So it feels one layer lower to me.
Okay, so hold on. Let me run this back to you, because I think this is the first time that I've thought about it that way. You can use AI and not have a AI infrastructure company like these LLM ops tools that you're talking about, but you can't use AI and not have a GPU.
That's right. That's right.
I see. Yeah. All right. All right. It makes a lot of sense now why those folks are in their own category as opposed to all the rest, like the evaluation or the orchestration tools.
That's right. It's just about the layer of abstraction that you're operating at. So coming back to your question, right? There's a ton of demand for compute, right? And that's because on one end, you have people who are training their own models, and that takes a ton of compute. And then once these models are trained, you obviously have them being slotted into applications and then running inference as a result, which is again compute on a GPU. So the claim that or the work that folks like Together are doing is, hey, we will provide some really, really interesting pieces of software that optimizes the utilization of these large scale GPU clusters, which then allows you to be, at the kind of the apex of this, cost and latency curve or frontier. And if you mentioned certain other companies, right? And some of these companies, what they're doing is they are acquiring GPUs and then kind of passing them through to the end user without much of those optimizations built in via software. So I think that's one thing to note, right? Like ultimately, if you again look at the work that companies like Together are doing, they're doing deep research right across training and inference. For example, Together has a chief scientist named Tree Dow, and he's the inventor of this thing called flash attention, and it's basically a way to train LLMs more efficiently, right? So he's commercializing this into Together's platform. Then, on the inference side, you can do some pretty nifty things with speculative decoding and what have you. And ultimately, what this boils down to is, can you offer compute more cost effectively without compromising latency and still have pretty good economics? I think that's the key piece to understand here.
So, all right, I can see that. Now let's go one level up, maybe two levels if we're coming from the GPU infrastructure area. And then we bypass the whole LLM ops area, and we go up to the application layer. And I know that you've had some excitement around there, and it feels like that's where things are happening. We just got done with the Agents in Production virtual conference. There was a ton of energy around it, like a ton. It feels like it is the new thing. Everyone's learning together. We had some great people that were sharing their knowledge, but nobody is an expert in this, right? Nobody's been doing it for more than a year. And even the team that we did it with, Prosus, they started their journey with agents, which really was in the beginning, it was just a rag. And that started 2 years ago. And it was about a year ago that they really started going with the agents. But that's one area of what feels like the application layer and how people are using that. I know it feels like one aspect that has been very clearly defined to have business value when it comes to agents is the customer support. Have you been seeing other areas where it's obvious that's gonna be an AI application area and we need to bet big on it?
Absolutely. So the application layer, first of all, has been the most exciting to us at this moment in time as investors at Kleiner Perkins. And to directly answer your question, software development has emerged as this pretty obvious application of LLMs, right? And for now, it's this autocomplete use case, right? Which is how do we essentially provide useful suggestions to developers within their IDE that allows them to move a lot faster. And um, it's a pretty beautiful use case if you think about it, especially in the context of being a wedge, because uh, on one end, you had, first of all, GitHub Copilot educate the market back in 2022 about why this is even useful, right? Which was very, very helpful to a bunch of startups that emerged in 23 that haven't had to pay that tax as a result,
Er,
and they've grown very quickly. But the other things to note are one, it's a use case where the LM will get it right, let's say 30% of the time. And when it gets it right, it's a very helpful thing for a software developer. They can move a lot faster. But if the suggestion is wrong in that 70%, it's not devastating. The developer just doesn't, tab complete, and then they try to figure it out on their own. And so as a result, you have this use case where there's a pretty provable productivity gain with at the same time, tolerance for error, right? So every
yeah.
CIO has now decided that they need to equip their software developers with some kind of coding accelerator. And that's opened up a huge market, right? As a result. So we have a company called Codium in our portfolio that's actually leading the charge here.
Yeah, Varun.
That's
Yeah, he
right.
came on here, and that was, I think, almost a year ago, and after we stopped recording, he was like, "Yeah, man, we used to be in the GPU space, but we got out of it, and it's, all for the better right now. We're doing really well."
That's right. He is operating in I would argue like the poster child market for this first wave of application companies. It's one of those markets where you can talk to any enterprise, any CIO within that enterprise. No one's going to disagree that they need one of these things, right? So we're very privileged to be in business with someone like Varun who's building Codium. And then I would say the other market is enterprise search, right? And so we are in business with a company called Glean that's leading the charge here, and that's another interesting case study where, Glean, first of all, the team is phenomenal. The CEO, Arvind, he was one of the co-founders of a company called Rubrik. They have one of the most technically stacked teams out there. When ChatGPT came out in 22, it was obviously, the watershed moment for AI. And I would say what was interesting about it again was that a lot of CIOs were like, hey, I want this on top of my own data. So it ended up being like a, again, market education phenomena where OpenAI was pouring all these resources into making ChatGPT a consumer product. You had these CIOs who obviously were fiddling around with ChatGPT saying, hey, it would be great if we had this on top of our own data. Glean had already built a bunch of these connectors to applications and data sources and were very quickly able to launch their own assistant that was privacy aware. And it's been lights out from there. So that's been another use case that's emerged as pretty consensus at this point, where every enterprise feels like they need it. And then we have seen, certain other use cases start to emerge and be very interesting, right? So we're in business with a company called Synthesia. They provide avatars for the enterprise, and we can talk about that. We have some companies in stealth that I would say I'm very excited about because they're using LLMs in a smart way in conjunction with well thought out product to, go after workflows that were previously like unaccessible, where you could have only owned, say, 70% of that workflow. But now again, by infusing the product with LLMs, you're able to go after the entirety of it because some of those workflows involved, reasoning over unstructured data, and now you finally can, right? So that's what I'm excited about, at least from this first wave. But as I'm sure we'll get into, this is only a stepping stone for what's to come, right? The whole dream for this AI movement is, can you get these things to be able to reason and well enough such that they can resemble resemble a human being, and as a result be a coworker versus a co-pilot.
Hey folks, quick break because I've got something you'll want to hear about. My friend Hugo Bound Anderson has a fantastic new podcast called High Signal, produced by Delphina. If you're working with data, this is your new must listen. Hugo's already hosted some incredible guests. Michael Jordan from Berkeley shared how AI could tackle global challenges, fascinating stuff about scaling solutions. Andrew Gelman from Columbia broke down his practical tips for better statistical thinking, the kind of stuff you can use right away. And coming up, you'll hear from tech pioneer Hillary Mason. The podcast is all about giving you high signal on how to build your career and make smarter decisions. Whether you're just starting out or leading data driven teams, there are 5 episodes live now, so check it out wherever you get your podcast. Links in the description. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, and I wanna get into that coworker versus co-pilot because I think that's a great way of putting the current versus the future scenarios. And but first I'll address a few of these points on, just starting with Codium. And when Varun came on here, he was the first person to talk about how much easier of a problem evaluation is when it comes to code versus when it comes to unstructured data of language. And he's like, if it runs, then you're kind of good. It may not be the most efficient, it may not be the best, but it still runs. So if it compiles and you're happy, then the other piece that I always think about when it comes to the coding tools and especially the AI coding tools is a segment of the evaluation metrics. If I were running it, right, I would be 100% looking at how much of the code that I suggested is still in production after 3 months or 6 months,
Yep.
because that's how you can know, like, the quality of this spaghetti code or non-spaghetti code that you're spitting out. Uh, then moving on, let me just remember what else you were talking about was the next one that Glean completely took over the market. So, the funny thing for me is that is it's almost like there's Glean or there is you're doing it yourself. And I know there's probably a ton of other tools in there, but what has been so amazing to me is how Glean took everything and just ran with it. And every time you hear about them, they're raising another 100, $200 million. And so it's outrageous. But the chat with your data is the quintessential hello world for AI. So the fact that Glean has had so much success when going back to what we were talking about earlier, how hard is the problem that you're dealing with? You would think that it's not that hard because everybody is creating this chat with your data. But then you recognize that chat with your data when you have a few PDFs versus chat with your enterprise data and across all of these different sources that and making sure that the right people have the right access to the data, and then you are constantly updating this access and constantly updating the data that's inside. That's where things get a little bit more difficult, and so I understand why Glean took the market on that one.
Yep. That's a great summary.
So the companies that are infusing it, I also wonder about how you feel when it comes to the no code, low code with AI and LLMs. Because I've seen quite a few use cases where you get someone that is on the sales team or that is in HR or they're on the marketing team, and they're able to create immense value for themselves because they spend a weekend or they spend maybe 2 weeks playing around with one of these low code, no code tools, recognizing that they can automate, like you said, 70% by themselves with their own workflow that they like, and they're able to just hit the ground running.
Mhm. That's right. Yeah, one of the beautiful things about this movement is that, you know, LLMs again are a higher form of abstraction. And before, if you had to unbundle them, you'd have probably had to write code to sort
Yeah.
of simulate the outputs of what you're getting today with LLMs. But today, all of that has now been pushed into the weights of these models, which basically means that non-technical folks can do a lot more, right? Because you have LLMs that get you pretty far along. So as a result, they're able to build and construct, bespoke applications, bespoke workflows, without any help of a developer, without needing to be technical, because LLMs now get them pretty far along.
Yeah. I do see different people wanting to cre take some of these low code, no code solutions or features or whatever they create, and then infuse it into the product that they're working on. And that's where you get this gigantic divide because you go from a low code, no code MVP type thing that works when you hit run and there's 1 or 5 people on the team and they're using it sparsely versus this is now a feature in your production application.
Right.
And so that divide and that disconnect, I think, is still not super close, but who knows where we'll be a little bit down the line. And the other thing that I was gonna ask, just when you said LLMs and it brought up in my mind, how are you feeling about LLM providers in general?
I would say it's just like an interesting battleground there, right? So, on one end, you have OpenAI and Anthropic that are pushing the limits of research and coming up with all sorts of new, methodologies, from the way they handle data to the way, obviously the algorithms that they're using under the hood. And then, I think they also even want to go down to the data center level and kind of own the optimization of compute and networking,
Yeah.
even at that layer. But then you have, the Metas of the world that are using a bunch of the free cash flow that their core business generates to outdo these guys, right? And so it's very interesting to see. And so far, by all benchmarks, OpenAI and Anthropic are still ahead of the open source ecosystem, but that gap
Yeah.
is only closed with every epoch of model released. And again, like coming back to Together is anchored on the fundamental belief that open source models will be good enough for the enterprise, such that, enterprises will use them at large and then will need to find a way to serve them efficiently. And as a result, use platforms like Together. Um, so it's a very interesting battleground. And, um, again, like as we know, models are the fastest depreciating asset. You pour all this money into them and they're impressive for a couple of months, and then someone else comes out with something that's better or better according to a certain set of benchmarks. And then you can ask the question, hey, like, was that investment worth it? What's interesting about OpenAI's strategy is that they've been smart about it. They've been integrating their models into ChatGPT, right? And ultimately, and monetizing via subscriptions, which is, a higher quality revenue than API calls. And that is a good strategy because at least, you can make the ROI case for model training and for having to, essentially burn more cash on bigger and bigger models. But there is this open question as to, will the scaling laws hold? And then what happens if they don't?
Huh.
And, how exposed are the model provider companies if they don't hold?
Exactly.
And
That's what I'm always wondering is, oh, we're gonna hit that point of diminishing returns, and then I like the idea of, yeah, they're exposed now. You find out that when the tide goes out, who's not wearing their clothes.
exactly. And it's a scary thought for these companies, right? Because again, all of their competitive advantage thus far has been from being able to provide these models with, billions and trillions of parameters. But, if we're reaching this saturation point for reasoning, right, then it's scary, right? And again, OpenAI has been smart by at least having this kind of brand value and distribution with ChatGPT that will still allow them to be a sustainable business. I think Anthropic needs to think about what their angle here is.
Uh-huh.
Um, but to me, I think the two interesting questions are one, is this test time compute approach the next frontier? Or do we actually just need to have something that goes beyond the transformer? The transformer has been very successful, right? And we've stretched it to its limitations, but do we need something new?
Which has been what I've been thinking a lot about and in the same camp, but you're almost expecting like a potentially like a once a lifetime event to happen because yeah, we need to go beyond the transformer. That's probably I imagine when deep learning was all the rage in the 70s and then the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, there was that same kind of idea and it happens at least decades apart.
Mhm.
So thinking that, all right, this is going to happen before these companies get exposed is a really wishful thinking in my eyes. And I also wanted to just mention that there are these other companies out there like the Mistrals and the Coheres, and I really wonder what's going to happen to them, right? If the Anthropics and OpenAIs are going to get burnt, then where is Cohere and Mistral in the conversation, if at all?
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a big it's a big question for them and their investors. And, they were always playing with fire a little bit by trying to essentially outdo these guys from a model competence standpoint. And um, it's always been hard for these independent providers to outdo these models, and they may have, their moment in the sun for a couple of minutes, but it's quickly washed away. So I'd be worried if I were them.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, all right, getting into the idea of co-pilots versus coworker,
Mhm.
what are your main thoughts or assumptions
Yeah.
on how that's gonna play out?
Yeah, look, again, I think coming back to this point about reasoning, it's about how do we cross the bridge from what we have today
Yeah.
to, the next level of reasoning? Because ultimately, again, this whole AI wave is exciting if we can stretch the limits of reasoning and get these things to act like human beings and do productive knowledge work as a result. And to me, a couple of just underpinning concepts that I've been thinking about is, how do you essentially leverage things like reinforcement learning, right? And how do you leverage techniques like, Monte Carlo tree search and what have you that have been successful in things like AlphaZero for chess playing, as an example, and kind of bring that to these models to get them to be able to be self-aware, reflect, intelligently prune a search space, right? That to me is the next frontier of reasoning, and um, I think I think we need to solve this reliably to unlock these coworker products, right? And if you can unlock these coworker products, then you can start pricing as a fraction of, wage spend, which is then when the markets become really big. Because again, if we look at these really exciting AI companies today they're great. And in some cases, they've created new categories out of dust, but they're SaaS companies, right? And that's fine, nothing wrong with SaaS, but for all the investment that's pouring into AI companies, if what we're getting out of it are SaaS companies with pretty known multiples, it's not going to end well for a lot of investors. So you actually need these coworker products to start hitting the market to justify the investment, because that's when they start tapping into a much, much bigger pool of dollars, which is essentially spend on labor.
Uh-huh. So a bit of a tangent from what you just said, that has constantly been going on in my mind is, if you think about agent companies right now, it used to be back in the day when you had engagement and you had people that were using your product, that was a very good thing. But now, because of the way that the pricing structures are, if someone is using your product, the more that they use it, that cuts into your profit margins. And I saw this very clearly when we were doing the Agents in Production conference, and the guys from the OLX team were showing me their new agent, OLX Magic. And they were giving me this demo, and I thought it was hilarious because I said, "Okay, now I'm thinking about buying a new car. Let's," and they said, "Yeah, yeah, we can do that. Here, watch. New car, what kind of car?" And I told them, Toyota hybrid. So we typed that in, and it was based in Poland, so it was in Polish Slutsky's. And forgive the pronunciation for anybody that's based in Poland, because I love calling them Schlotzkys. Just go with it. All right. So then I said, "Well, how much is that in euros?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, we can ask that." So they ask, we get the prices in euros. And then I said, "Okay, well, now ask, how can I convert a Polish license plate to a German one because I'm in Germany?" And they go, "No, no, no, we have guardrails on that. You can't just use this like ChatGPT, man. Give me a break." And I'm like, "But that's related to my question. Like, if I'm going to buy a car in Poland, I want to know all these things." So and they said, "Well, yeah, but you got to go to some other provider for that. We can't just be basically giving you this for free." And so that was a huge click in my mind on, when you're building these products, you can't let the user do everything that they want, or you don't have that ability per se, because if you're rolling it out to millions of users and then each user is doing on use 7 or 8 calls to a model, that can add up really quickly.
It's a great point. It's totally a great point. It's like every inference is essentially, cogs, right, at the end of the
Yeah.
day. Um,
You hurt, you "Oh, they're asking another question? Oh," it's so in a way, you're like, "Yes, I want them to use it," and they told me they have a metric that if it's 2 or 3, it doesn't do anything to conversion.
mhm.
And if it's after 7, it also doesn't do anything to conversion, because it's just somebody that's playing around with it and trying to see what it can get. But from that 3 to 7, that's the sweet spot, and they see conversion really went up. So it made it worth it for them. But I am constantly thinking about these 7 plus, where maybe you do wanna know all these answers, or that you have all these questions, but they are trying to think about ways to cut you off from, after you've asked 7 questions, they're like, "Yeah, actually, this is down for the moment."
Yeah, it's a great point, and it kind of, if you walk that backwards, it actually points to how under optimized we are at the data center level, right? Because ultimately these applications are paying a tax to the model providers in the form of API calls. Why are those model providers charging what they are? It's because they have their own underlying costs with how much it took to train the model and serve it, right? And then it points to, okay, then how is model training happening under the hood? It's so under optimized, right? Like you essentially have, you're burning a lot of compute, right? And at the end of the day, the networks, at least at the moment, in terms of the way they're designed, are pretty under optimized for these kinds of workloads, and that's only pushing up costs, right? So and then GPUs are expensive because of the whole supply demand imbalance, and um, we just need a lot of pieces to come together at many different layers, right? Like I would say we need, like, some challengers to NVIDIA's dominance that we can bring overall prices of compute down. We need
Yeah.
network fabrics to be a lot more efficient, right? So that LM training costs go down, and then you just need to be able to have these chips get ever more powerful so that you can rely on fewer of them, which again will push LM costs down, and that trickles
Yeah.
all the way up to lower costs for a model to be served,
Yeah, and
lower
and
API pricing.
reliable. Like, the
Reliable.
GPUs are so unreliable, and I think my favorite way of hearing this was when Todd Underwood gave a talk at the AI quality conference we did, and he said, you can look at a GPU the wrong way and it'll go offline. You can walk around a data center, and because of the way that your feet are hitting the ground, you just blew out a whole cluster right there. And obviously he's making a joke, but it shows you how weak these are. And if you read any of the blogs, you can see how GPUs going offline is going to happen no matter what, and folks are just trying to figure out how they can deal with it and quickly get them back online or minimize the blast radius when it goes offline so that they can switch those training jobs quickly to other pools.
So true, and it's you can imagine how complex this problem is at scale, right? When you have, you know, you're trying to train the biggest models that are distributed across thousands of GPUs, and you first of all are trying to get max out the utilization, the flops in particular from these
Yeah.
GPUs, and if it goes down, then it can actually impact entire training runs, right? You really can't afford for them to go down. So yeah, and that by the way contributes to higher costs, right? So it to me it feels like training costs are like you know 3-4x what they could be if we had more reliability of GPUs.
Well, knowing all of these inefficiencies in the training and the GPUs, does that not make you want to go and try and invest at that level? Or is it because there's only a handful of model trainers? It's like, yeah, I don't know if it's worth it.
I do think investing close to the data center is interesting, right? And again, I think venture investors who've put money into a company like Vast have done well, or they're pretty happy. And then again, you know, people who've invested in some of these compute providers have done well. So there's something there. I actually find networking pretty interesting. I actually feel like for the first time in a long time, there's a clear why now to invest in a networking company, right? Like the way at least the hyperscalers are approaching LLM training is they're literally provisioning separate networks just for LLM training. Um, but even still, that's inefficient, right? Like the hardware could be a lot better than what it is today. There's a lot of talk about, for example, whether network interface cards should be smart. um, there is a lot you could do in terms of how you provision a network, and essentially how do you get it to be a lot higher throughput,
Mm.
higher bandwidth. So there's something interesting there for sure. Go to market will be very tricky for companies operating at this layer, and I think that's what we have to factor in as investors.
Why?
Because you first of all have on one end, you're selling to a pretty narrow customer set. That's one.
Mhm.
The second is you do have existing players. Right, you have, the Broadcoms, you have the Aristas, you have, even to some extent, I guess, like a Cisco that are trying to move
Sure.
into this space. You have, some of these guys that are also doing their own work, right? Like Azure and I even know Facebook is kind of like investing in innovating themselves at this layer. So then,
Yeah.
what is it that you're going to do as the quote unquote wedge, right? that all these guys buy from, and then what does that get you? I think those are gonna be two interesting questions to answer.
But do you think there are credible solutions out there that are able to increase the throughput? Because I can imagine if you did have something that you could just show, "Hey, look, 2x in the throughput here, you're golden."
Yeah, I think people are working on this. I wouldn't say there's a silver bullet just yet, right?
Yeah.
Because you can show this at like, subscale, but can you prove it at that kind of scale? I think
Yeah,
that's still
hundreds of
work.
thousands of GPUs
That's right.
is a whole different beast than just connecting 2 GPUs that are right next to each other together.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah, I could see
Yeah,
that.
and by the way,
Okay, so
NVIDIA itself is doing a lot of work here, right? So you have to overcome that
yeah,
beast as well. Like, as we know, like when a box ships, it's typically got 4 to 8 GPUs that are interconnected via this thing called NVLink, right? So you're not going to really beat that. So then you have to probably play in this kind of like internode space, right? And how do you make
yeah.
communications across these nodes for LM workloads a lot more efficient?
Yeah, and you need to just go after folks that have lots of nodes. So you're instantly looking at a really long sales cycle. You're looking at how are you going to get someone to commit to using you. I can see the go to market would just be really difficult. So it makes it hard to want to invest in something like that. And how much can you saturate a market like that? Uh, I wouldn't know because I am by no means an expert in this, but I would think like after you've sold to OpenAI and Meta and Anthropic, maybe you're kind of good. Then, all right, you can go after XAI, you can go after Mistral, and then who else? Or maybe there is that, well, once it becomes a standard, everyone's going to use it because it's better. So it doesn't matter if you have 5 GPUs or if you have 5,000.
Yeah, and look, I think if you can overcome some of these challenges that we just talked about, you know, I would say like yes, while a lot of investors will say customer concentration is bad, like there are successful companies we can look at that have immense customer concentration,
Yeah.
but
And they're
but
doing
but
great.
but they're doing great. Nvidia is not Nvidia arguably is a company with a lot of customer concentration, right? So um, I think the question is how do you kind of overcome some of those hurdles, and if that results in you having a few handful of customers that are paying you an insane amount of money, that's not bad. And then by the way, inference ends up, in my opinion, being the big opportunity because
Huh.
ultimately every business is going to have LM applications as we know, and inference is just going to be such a pervasive workload, many orders of magnitude bigger than training. So if what you built is gives you the foundation to go after inference in some shape or form, then by all means.
Yeah. So we have a sponsor of a big company, big cloud company that I won't say exactly who it is just to keep them unnamed. And I was talking to them about why they wanted to sponsor us. And they were saying, yeah, well, we have a lot of people doing AI on our cloud, and we want to know more about what they're doing, and we want to get closer to them. So I asked, oh, yeah, really? We have so many people that are training models? Is that what's going on? And they said, no, no, no. The majority of the money is being made on inference here. Don't get it twisted. This is where things are happening. The training is great. We love it. We're not going to turn them away, but the inference is where the real cash is being made.
That's right. And I think with this whole test time compute paradigm, at least seeming interesting, I would say the jury's out so far in terms of how effective it can be. But if that paradigm continues to yield exciting results, then but no doubt inference is going to be, way, way, way bigger than training. It's going to eclipse training as we know it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating, man. Well, before we jump, anything that you are super excited about, something maybe that you just recently invested in or that you're looking to invest in, the types of companies we talked about, the application layer, we talked about customer success or the coding. You kind of got tools that you already invested in there. So if somebody's doing stuff in that space, I don't recommend that they reach out to you. If somebody's doing stuff in what space should they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm really excited by people that are trying to push the frontier of what agents are capable of. And again, comes back to what we talked about. Can you build a application that is able to truly automate a useful unit of work, right? And so just to give you some examples, right? Like there are companies that are trying to, automate the work of security operations analysts. There are companies that are trying to, automate the work of BPOs. There are companies that are trying to automate the work of site reliability engineers. And these are
Yeah.
just like really interesting potential applications where the underlying technology is very hard to build because you have to again get these things to be able to reason reliably over large swaths of data, multimodal data sets, and anyone who can crack that will find themselves in a pretty big market. So people who are thinking along these lines, trying to push the frontier of reasoning for agents, where there's a pretty tangible value proposition at the end of the day. I'm very excited to meet those people.